2. The idea of purchasing another person as if they were livestock or a second-hand car would horrify most of us. The thought of ripping a child from its mother's embrace to sell them to the highest bidder, or witnessing a man and woman whipped without mercy, or simply being worked until they drop dead, these images are almost unthinkable now. Yet for the vast majority of human history, across every corner of the globe, this is precisely how those who called themselves masters treated those they referred to as slaves. It's about exploitation. It's about injustice. It's about violence. You had no rights because you were, quite simply, property. The very concept of owning another human being is abhorrent to us today, but back then it was a method of purchasing labor, something people needed. But how could anyone prioritize economic gain over the humanity of their fellow beings? And how could such a monstrous system endure for so long? No one willingly chooses enslavement. The only way you end up a slave is through force. The real reasons people had slaves, and why most eventually freed them, lay at the heart of a remarkable story. A story about the world's incomplete journey from bondage to liberty. Since the dawn of civilization, slavery has been woven into human existence. All our great empires, and most of the monuments they left behind, were constructed on the backs of enslaved people. Confronting the true history of slavery also means confronting the reality that human beings lived alongside, profited from, and were enmeshed in slavery for nearly all of recorded history. It seems almost foundational to how we relate to one another as humans. It's always present in some shape, sometimes more brutal, sometimes slightly milder. In ancient cultures like China, Babylon, and Assyria, slavery initially took a relatively mild form. Back then, it wasn't usually a permanent condition, nor was it passed down through generations. Even in ancient Egypt, slaves were typically prisoners of war who served their captors only until a treaty was negotiated or a ransom was paid. Then they went home. But this was merely the beginning of slavery's camouflage. From there, it branches into thousands upon thousands of cultural and historical variations, reinvented by different societies in different ways. تكريس 387 BC. Plato, one of history's greatest philosophers, journeyed from Athens to the island of Sicily to offer governance advice to the local ruler, Dionysius. But when Plato dared to call Dionysius a tyrant, the enraged king ordered his cowards to seize the philosopher and bought him up for sale to the highest bidder. Suddenly, Plato faced a future he himself had once described as worse than death. Becoming a slave truly could be a fate worse than death. In ancient Greece, to be enslaved also meant being completely cut off from any hope that your children would inherit anything. You became, in essence, a known person. These known persons were essential to the Greeks, who had established the world's first true slave society, one that relied on enslaved labor for its very survival. To meet their ever-growing demand for workers, the Greeks began turning slavery from a temporary state into a lifelong sentence for slaves and all their descendants. And anyone was vulnerable, essentially, anyone could become a slave. Slavery wasn't based on race like it would be later in the United States. There was no external marker. You didn't have to be black to be a slave. As Plato discovered, falling into slavery became as simple as being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or just saying the wrong thing. Fortunately for the philosopher, his friends and family learned of his predicament and rushed to the slave market just in time to buy him back from his captors. Plato returned to Athens with his freedom intact, but his narrow escape may have made him reconsider how slavery was practiced in Greece. For the rest of his life, he argued that it was only proper to enslave barbarians, not civilized men like himself and his fellow Greeks. People have had too few slaves as others, in many ways, to justify enslaving them. It's extremely difficult to take a human being and treat them like an animal, or even worse, without finding some way to diminish their humanity. Plato's brightest student, Aristotle, absorbed this lesson well. In Aristotle's view, there are natural slaves, people born into a condition that makes them suited for bondage. This became an argument for justifying the enslavement of conquered peoples, as well as those who seemed uncivilized. In his major work on politics, Aristotle put this idea into words that would be used to defend slavery for the next 1,000 years. It is clear that some men are by nature free, and others slaves, and that for the latter, slavery is both beneficial and just. All would decree that the inferior class should be slaves to the superior. The Greeks had reached a pivotal moment in slavery's history. From then on, people would rationalize enslaving others by claiming their victims were less human or less entitled to freedom. In the centuries that followed, a new empire would spread this concept of slavery across the known world and push it to unprecedented levels of brutality. Rome, ad 61. Shocking news spread through the city. Berenice Secundus, one of the empire's most influential men, had been murdered by one of his own slaves. Now act terrified the citizens of Rome more, as they lived surrounded by thousands of slaves. Large households could have up to 4,000 or 5,000 slaves, mainly on agricultural estates, but there was also a significant number within the city of Rome itself. Whatever the exact figures, there were probably always more slaves than freed people in cities like Rome, Alexandria, Milan, or any other major hub of the Roman Empire. For the Romans, the greatest challenge was forcing these enormous populations of slaves to accept their lot without provoking them to revolt. The constant threat of a slave uprising kept many Romans on edge and made crimes like the murder of Berenice Secundus especially frightening. For centuries, Romans had tried to protect themselves by making the murder of a master by a slave the ultimate offense. And it wasn't just the killer who was expected to pay. Tradition demanded that all 400 slaves belonging to Berenice be executed for his murder. The punishment had to be, and was seen as, absolutely draconian, plain for all to see. Why? Because there was this continuous fear, if you let one slave rise up against a master, you would have chaos. But a different kind of chaos erupted when an angry crowd rushed to the Senate to protest the verdict. Slaves might be property, they insisted, but they are also human beings. Cassius, a member of one of Rome's most distinguished families, would have none of it. With the slaves' fate hanging in the balance, he stood in the Senate and showed a call for justice, Roman style. Fought mercy in heaven's name, and then who will be kept safe by the number of his slaves? 400 did not protect Bednius Secundus. In the end, Cassius's demand for strict enforcement of Roman law prevailed. As soldiers held back the slaves, horrified defenders, executioners dragged all 400 men, women, and children who had belonged to Bednius to the place of execution and slaughtered them. Not even their place to their beacon codes could save them. But would in no code show more mercy? Rome, the year 596. A new ruler governed a city vastly different from the one that had witnessed the murder of Bednius Secundus, and yet much the same. His name was Gregory, remembered by history as the Pope Gregory the Great. In 596, the Pope had a problem concerning slaves, but it wasn't the issue people today might expect. People think Christianity profoundly changed the plight of slavery. It's nice to imagine Christianity as this saving religion that helps those in bondage. Unfortunately, like so much else, the reality is quite different. The reality was that Gregory was eager to buy slaves. As heir to Imperial Rome, his church now owned vast tracts of land. Fields still needed plowing, codes still needed manufacturing, and owning slaves seemed like the only reliable way to get the work done. What's crucial to recognize about Christianity is that it evolved in a slave-owning society. If you're part of such a society, you won't question that institution primarily at all. Instead of challenging slavery, Gregory and his fellow Christians simply adapted Aristotle's ancient ideas about who should or shouldn't be a slave to fit the times. They forbade the enslavement of Christians and decreed that only non-Christians deserved bondage, leaving Gregory free to buy all the slaves he needed from beacon places like Britain and bring them back to Rome. It seemed that in Christendom, at least, slavery was here to stay. But Christianity wasn't the only new faith to embrace this ancient institution. Arabi, in the middle of the 7th century, a prophet named Muhammad was preaching a new religion called Islam and offering his followers fresh advice about slaves. A man came to the prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and said, "Guide me to a deed that makes me close to heaven and far from hell." The prophet replied, "Free a person and redeem a slave." Muhammad, more than any Christian leader of his time, seemed to recognize slavery's inhumanity. Yet he and his new religion continued to take slavery for granted. Muhammad himself owned the slaves and once led his followers to slaughter hundreds of men from a non-Muslim tribe that had betrayed him, taking the women and children as slaves. But he protected his own followers from a similar fate by forbidding the enslavement of Muslims by Muslims, just as Christians were forbidden to enslave Christians. This left the warriors of both faiths free to enslave each other when they met in battle during the Crusades in the 11th and 12th centuries. It was the beginning of a cross-cultural competition for slaves that would persist for over 6 centuries, well into the Renaissance and beyond. There was a flourishing slave trade in Venice during the Renaissance, flourishing, of course, at that time. Indeed, you could no longer trade in Christian slaves, so you traded in Muslim slaves. But by the 1400s, The Muslims had built a society as powerful as Christian Europe. Any known Muslim who ventured to the Middle East or North Africa in search of slaves risked being enslaved themselves. For their own safety, Europeans had to find other sources for the slaves they prized. Over the next few centuries, their search would lead to no places and a no type of slavery, when best on ras. 1755 West Africa. In 11 شرطة year شرطة old boy named Untold Equino was playing in his yard when he was suddenly kidnapped. His captors dragged him through the forest to the Atlantic coast. There, he was clinged up and placed in a holding cell with other Africans to await the arrival of European slave traders, who made frequent stops along the coast to pick up human cargo. Like Untold, people are terrified. They're separated from their families, from loved ones. They may have seen them slaughtered where they came from. They're hungry and may ill. They're being prepared, cleaned up, to be purchased at the seaside and then put on boats to travel across the seas. But Equino and his fellow captives weren't bound for Europe. They were being shipped off to the new European colonies in America, where slaves were in high demand and fetched top prices. Africans had become a hot commodity in a thriving transatlantic slave trade that had started over 300 years before Equino was captured and would last for almost 100 more. During those centuries, 13 million innocent victims, just like Equino, would be stolen from their homes and sent into slavery. Years later, Equino would recall his time on a slave ship as the darkest moments of his life. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene a horror almost inconceivable. I expected every hour to share the fate of my companions, some of whom were daily brought upon deck at the point of death, which I began to hope would soon put an end to my miseries. As an adult, Equino finally regained his freedom and found fame as a passionate opponent of this inhuman commerce. But most of his fellow captives weren't so lucky. Up to 20% of the men, women, and children forced into the dark holds of these ships died under the cruel and crowded conditions. The survivors were doomed to give their lives to taming a harsh and unfamiliar land. The need for labor was profound. We were in a heavily forested, otherwise occupied territory. The thought was, if you take a people out of their home place and drop them in a new place that is significantly far, and you mix up their numbers, you can control that crowd of people much better. And you've caught a crowd of people who are clearly identifiable as a servant class. But how could their new masters ensure that the members of this servant class remained servants? And how could they justify the brutal oppression needed to keep their slaves from rising up in revolt? In places like the American South, slave owners once again looked back to the revered cultures of ancient Greece and Rome to find the answers. They said, "This is simply the way human beings have always lived. You know, we are creating a society based on slavery in exactly the way the noble ancient Greeks created their society, the way the noble Romans created their society. And those buildings with those big white columns in the deep south were an echo of the slaveholding classical society of the Greeks and Romans that the Southerners very consciously took up as a symbol of their life, a cultured, sophisticated life, but based upon a slave economy." There's a direct line from Aristotle straight through the beginnings of slavery in the New World. His used right up through the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries to justify natural hierarchies that permit enslavement as a just condition. But Aristotle had never based his idea of slavery on race. So Southerners turned to their Bibles to find a justification for enslaving people based on the color of their skin. They found it in the story of Noah. According to Genesis, Noah, in a moment of rage, had condemned the children of his son Ham to be servants for all time. Southerners claimed that Ham's descendants had settled in Africa. Therefore, Africans were born to be slaves. The proof was in their black skin, the mark of Noah's curse. Being black in the United States was at some level a mark of slavery. Blackness was understood to be a mark of degradation, which went along with slavery. Armed with the arguments of Aristotle and their own reinterpretation of the Bible, Southerners began to enshrine racial slavery in the laws of the land. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. All Negroes and other slaves already imported or hereafter to be imported into this province, and all children now born or hereafter to be born of such Negroes and slaves, shall be slaves during their natural lives. It was economically expedient to enslave people and to make that slavery perpetual and hereditary. You didn't have to be a slave. It cost a lot to buy a slave, $500, $600, $800. You might have a bid for a teenage male, but that would buy itself off. It would be a wise expenditure in the long run. By the mid-1700s, the enslavement of Africans had been transformed into a very profitable enterprise. But even as the trade in black slaves reached its peak, some people began to wonder how slavery, and especially slavery based solely on race, could ever be justified. Paris in the 1700s, in a time history calls the Enlightenment. Our understanding of the natural world had been transformed by the scientific methods pioneered by Isaac Newton. Now, a group of philosophers was trying to use those same methods of observation to investigate the nature of man. And once you start doing that, you start asking a whole new set of questions. What is man? What is human nature? What do we observe when we look at man and nature? He's free, that's his most natural state, and his equal. Before that, we were really talking about chains of being and where people were on that sort of ladder of being. Whites were at the top, and from there we went ethnically, we thought of much though. Africans were thought to be very much like primates, like apes. So we were at the bottom of that chain, or near the bottom. The Enlightenment's rejection of this hierarchy was a direct attack on the way the Western world had thought about slavery since the days of Aristotle, almost 1,000 years before. Charles, the Baron de Montesquieu, one of the most influential thinkers of the time, led the charge. Aristotle endeavors to prove that there are natural slaves, but what he says is far from proving it. As all men are born equal, slavery must be accounted natural. These are extremely radical ideas. In the beginning, they are being talked about between a very small number of people in private settings. They are so radical that they are absolutely censored. It would take Faulkner, one of the most popular authors of the day, to finally bring the Enlightenment's radical anti-slavery message to a wider audience. Slavery is an inefficient that violates man's original free nature. Poets sometimes suggest that a poor laborer would rather be a pampered slave. But as the laborer, he will cling to his freedom, and a slave in turn will choose freedom over slavery, even if he must leave the kindest of masters to face unseen hardships. The Enlightenment idea that man is born free and equal in nature created a philosophically coherent basis for challenging the notion of slavery. It was irrefutable. It still is to this day. And it's the strongest weapon that was available then, and it's the strongest weapon we still have today for arguing against slavery wherever we find it. The last slave was sold in Paris in 1762, and in 1794, slavery itself would be banned throughout France. But in the rest of Europe and the Americas, including the newly formed United States, slaves were still waiting for freedom to arrive. أبستا نيويورك, the early 1800s. Thousands gathered to join in a great Protestant religious revival sweeping through England and America. They called it the Great Awakening. It would make the people look at slavery in a whole new way. Lots of religious sects are beginning to take root and spring up in the United States, and the people are trying to cleanse the nation of its sins. Part of that sin is slavery. In the Protestant countries, Christianity played a much stronger role in the abolitionist movement because Protestantism was already a more egalitarian religion to begin with. It had rejected the notion of a church hierarchy from the papacy downward, and it believed that every individual had a direct relationship to God. Protestant England abolished slavery in 1833. But in the United States, the religious campaign to end slavery still faced enormous resistance from slave owners and their advocates. Across America, a new generation of abolitionists was convinced that the time for ending slavery had arrived. Religious speakers, black and white, male and female, as we close in on the Civil War, talk about slavery in the middle of their sermons where they might not have talked about it before. Slavery comes up not only as a sin on the nation, but it becomes the individual's sin as well. So it's not just that you own slaves, but that you don't act against slavery in a more political way. But in the American South, these moral and political arguments were winning few converts. Slaves were worth 3 times the value of all of the nation's railroads, manufacturing, and industry combined. Their labor produced most of the goods the country exported. Southern slave owners feared that without slaves, the economy would collapse. And they knew that contortions, intellectual, philosophical, religious contortions, as they attempt to explain why a country that is based on universal liberties allows slavery as well. It's a contradiction that tore them to pieces and ultimately cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Outraged Southerners like Confederate President Jefferson Davis claimed to see no contradiction in a way of life as old as time itself. Slavery was established by decree of Almighty God. It is sanctioned in the Bible, in both Testaments. It has existed in all ages and has been found among the people of the highest civilizations. But the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening had changed the way people looked at slaves. Thoughtless, powerful arguments had won over former supporters of slavery like Abraham Lincoln. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Although volume upon volume is written to prove slavery is a very good thing, we never hear of the man who wishes to take the code of it by being a slave himself. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. In the end, it would take a devastating civil war and the deaths of almost 600,000 Americans to resolve the crisis. With the South's surrender and the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in December 1865, legal slavery in the United States finally came to an end. But the world's journey from slavery to freedom was far from over. People tend to believe that slavery is a thing of the past. Interestingly, in the United States particularly, we tend to pat ourselves on the back and say, well, we got rid of slavery. But there are something like 27 million people in slavery today. From places like the Sudan and North Africa to Southeast Asia and even Europe and the Americas, people are still being enslaved. Slavery right now is a key. Whether it's people selling their children into slavery, especially their daughters, workers being kidnapped into slavery for their sexual labor and other simple work, it's horrific. It's even hard to describe once you read about it and learn about it. Today, slavery has become harder to detect and define. Many people are tricked into slavery through fraudulent contracts or loans. They do the same labor as other impoverished people but without pay or the freedom to live. Slaves today may have it a little harder than slaves in human history. The key difference is that slaves who would have cost a lot of money in the past now cost very little indeed because there's a glut of potential slaves on the market. And that means that slaves today are disposable in a way that they never were in the past. If they get injured, they're not given medical care. If they get sick, they're not given medical care. They're not given enough food to necessarily keep them alive for very long because they're so cheap. You just use them up and throw them away. But there are signs of hope. Slavery is now legal in every country in the world, and the fight to end this ancient crime against humanity is gaining no momentum. Any kind of slavery is a condition of tyranny and therefore can't be sustained as a just society or a good society. There are a handful of criminals who are still invested in the idea of having slavery, but 99.9% of all human beings are agreed slavery should stop. They don't want to live in a world of slavery. There are no United Nations conventions, no anti-slavery organizations, no groups to liberate slaves around the world. To me, it's incredibly exciting to think that this could be the generation that, after 5,000 years, could leave a gift to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to say, this is the generation that brought an end to slavery.